Kia ora everyone. I'm Chris Morrison. I'm the chair of OANZ. OANZ is the national sector body representing the organic community. Welcome everyone to this webinar on regenerative capital. It's certainly very timely and relevant. We're very grateful to have two excellent guest speakers today to discuss this topic. First, we have Robyn O'Brien, co-founder of rePlant Capital. While based in the US, Robyn has a very close relationship with New Zealand. OANZ is very fortunate to have Robyn on our advisory board. Second, we have Mike Taitoko from Calm the Farm. He's also a co-founder of Calm the Farm. Mike, like Robyn, is very committed to regenerative agriculture and helping farmers transition. Calm the Farm are members of OANZ. Shortly, we're going to have Mike and Robyn introduce themselves and their organisations. Everyone, we will have the speakers muted, but you have the opportunity to write questions into the chat room, and if we have time, we will get to some of those. We've had a number of questions already sent in prior to the webinar, and I think the hour is going to go very quickly. So very sorry if we can't get to all your questions. The meeting has been recorded. We're going to have it on our YouTube channel, and it will also be on the OANZ website. So looking forward to this very, very interesting topic. And first of all, Robyn, if you could please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about rePlant Capital, that'd be fantastic.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for joining everyone. My mother is from New Zealand. I'm named after a farmer in Palmerston North, and that entire side of my family is in New Zealand. So I wish I could be with you in person today, joining you down there. But I come to you from Boulder, Colorado, which is where I've lived for the last 21 years with my family and 4 children. I'm a co-founder of rePlant Capital after spending my entire career in the food and agricultural industries. As we saw the consumer really start to transition their demand towards products that are free from certain ingredients, it became really obvious in the work that I was doing with the multinational food companies that their supply chain wasn't there. And here in the United States, we have 911 million farmable acres, but only 1% of those are organic. And so what has literally happened is we've bottlenecked that supply. The multinational food companies and their relationships with conventional banks, those lenders and those banks don't understand the dynamics of this space towards this transition. And we saw an opportunity at rePlant to literally provide that transition capital, that transition financing. So what does that look like? So we work with the growers in the United States. There's been incredible interest from around the world in the model that we have executed and developed. But we work with growers to help them transition their farmland towards regenerative organic agriculture. A lot of the growers in the United States are under enormous debt pressure. There have been suicides and opioid epidemics in American farmers. They carry $426 billion in debt. And I know New Zealand farmers carry a similar proportional level of debt. That debt makes it really difficult for farmers to transition. On top of that, the US farmers have a negative on-farm income. So for those that want to try to put their kids through school, support their families, they are dealing with a negative income. In that crisis, what has also emerged is the legacy crisis. So we have created an industry that is massively in debt with negative on-farm income, and with the next generation not wanting to step into that. So as we were analyzing that, what we looked at was we have this enormously extractive model, this agrochemical model, where farmers were literally in debt, repeatedly financing the chemicals that are required to grow their crops. And as the chemical levels increase, we see the charts from the United States Department of Agriculture, just the application of these chemicals. Parallel to that is the increase in debt levels. And so we looked at that and thought, what does regenerative capital look like to come alongside this transition? And if we think about capital differently, what is actually needed to support the farmer? And so here in the US, farmers had been completely guided to focus only on yield. And what was sacrificed was their profitability. So we stepped back and said, what does it look like to create a financial model where you put the farmer first? Food security is a global issue. There is no food security without financial security and financial resiliency for farmers. So for us, that is absolutely a core value to the work that we do. As part of our guiding compass is the financial resiliency of the farmer. So we deploy capital to these farmers that are interested in the transition. Some aren't. We're not there to try to convince anybody of what to do, but the farmers that are interested in learning about this transition towards regenerative organic agriculture, what they're actually learning beyond getting a loan from rePlant is this technical assistance and going from a very intense chemical input model to this regenerative model, which is much more about servicing soil health. Clearly in Australia, we have seen the water crisis. We have the same thing happening here in California with a massive water crisis. What we know is that by focusing on soil health, by holding that as a North Star, the benefits underneath that are tremendous. And we can talk about water infiltration, we can talk about water conservation, we can talk about soil organic matter, and we can talk about carbon sequestration. My bias, my North Star, is on water conservation because of how critical it is to the success of our growers, our farmers, and ultimately society as a whole. What we've seen is that in this transition to regenerative, depending on the crop type, there can be up to 500% increase in water infiltration. So I think it's important to note, especially because of the deep ties that I have in New Zealand, that as a team, rePlant chose to start with the dairy industry. We understand the complexity there. We understand all of the tension that can be created in that industry. So our first partner is Danone, and they were the world's first, North America's first and the largest B Corp certified corporation, which means that their values are really aligned towards this regenerative process. And candidly, they have shared with us how, even these conventional bankers coming in don't understand what is actually required in this transition. So they were looking for a capital partner that could work with them, work with these values, and work towards regeneration. It is regenerative capital because the savings that are generated from the regenerative projects that we are doing with Danone's dairy farmers, their LOI makes sure that those savings go straight back into the next regenerative project. So it's one of many of the multinational partners that we're working with. And it's really exciting to see the interest at the farm level, the interest from the food industry, and then really importantly, the interest that we're seeing from investors.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robyn. Great work you're doing. Mike, over to you. If you can just give us a little bit about your background and Karma Farm.
Thank you, Chris. Kia ora koutou, ko Mike Taitoko takuingoa no mani potaho. Firstly, thanks for the invite to be part of this webinar, Chris, and to the OANZ team. Super awesome kaupapa that we're really happy to support. And I just want to acknowledge Robyn too. When we started doing a deep dive into the regen ag and regen organic space as a potential solution for Aotearoa to start to think about transitioning into finding new and better ways to think about how we carry out and grow our food system and agricultural systems in a way that's going to better protect and look after our natural environment. We did a deep dive, and I took a couple of trips up to the US, and I was fortunate to see Robyn speak at a couple of the conferences we went to on regenerative food systems and regenerative capital. And I've got to say, of the kind of huge amount of people that I've met with and interviewed and watched it at various conferences and presentations, the work that Robyn's done over pretty much at least 2 decades, coming at it from an analyst and a food industry perspective, in my view, is Robyn has one of the kind of most leading, influential, innovative ways of thinking about how we drive this change to clean up our food systems at large scale, and getting to the heart of this, which is where we landed too with Toha and Karma Farm as well, is that if we can't find ways to get friendlier capital and finance to the front line, to the farmers and the heroes that are actually making the difference and driving the change, then we're really not going to crack this to the degree of the scale we need to. So we've looked closely at a lot of Robyn's work and Robyn's peers. And so Robyn, kia ora to you for, I guess, paving the way and carving and making it easy for people like this to come along and ride on those coattails, where hopefully we can kind of accelerate this transition here in Aotearoa. So my background, I came at this from a data and analytics perspective as well. When we first started getting involved, I had a couple of companies that were doing consulting, a bit of legal work in the commercial space, particularly with iwi and Māori. policy around land use. We started running data analytics and a data platform across things like freshwater quality, impacts on land use from a Western scientific standpoint, but also from a Mātauranga Māori and cultural indicators standpoint. So we could start to see where the good, the bad, the ugly of what sort of land use and land practices were impacting on our freshwater systems and also on our food systems, and at a slightly longer bow, but there are correlations there around the impact that food systems are having on ability for a lot of our kids to think about through the education schooling system, how they learn and what they need to learn. And so the freshwater issue for New Zealand became, as everyone knows, it became a political issue when this current government first got in 4 years ago. And what they saw and what we saw was the communities were really starting to sit up and take notice about the impacts of our freshwater and quality on our freshwater. So we took quite an interest in that as a kind of from a data standpoint. At the same time, we were really starting to see that the ability to kind of push through the breakthrough science or the technologies or on-farm practices or methodologies were really hard to have that conversation in the New Zealand policy and science setting. And so at that time, a bunch of us were really starting to wonder how we could, what's the missing piece to all of this? How do we break through these barriers to change? And like Robyn, we determined that the financial infrastructure was actually missing in the middle, the infrastructure that helps to get that grant money, the capital, the debt financing down to the farmers in a friendly enough way to give them the space to be able to make that transition to a productive, profitable farming model that at the same time can prove and demonstrate they're having a lighter environmental, creating a lighter environmental footprint. And so three of us got together. Sean Hendy, Professor Sean Hendy, he's out of Auckland University. Most people know Sean more recently as the guy who's been leading the COVID modelling for the Prime Minister and government. Prior to getting dragged away to solve for COVID, Sean and a couple of our science team were working on looking at regenerative agriculture. What's the network modelling we need to do, and what are the sorts of complexity theory and data-driven things that we need to understand better in order to scale this and testing out with farmers and industry advisors and all sorts of industry players. And that got us off to a really great start in terms of understanding some of the dynamics and the tensions and the opportunities. And then unfortunately, Sean got dragged off to solve for COVID, and we're super pleased that that occurred. And we got him back again for a bit to help us throughout the journey. But so Sean's been leading out that side of understanding it. The other co-founder, Natalie Whitaker, Nat built Give a Little, and she ran that for a number of years. Most of you know it's our leading crowdfunding platform in New Zealand. And what Nat learned during that journey was she started to understand why people ask for help and why people put their hands in their pockets and provide that help through financial means. And at the other side of that, between Sean, Natalie, and myself, we really started to see that unless we could find a way, as I said earlier, to break through some of this kind of the choke points around getting funding to the people at the front who are demonstrating that they're making change at scale, then we're not going to solve these big, hairy, complex problems, certainly not going to solve existential problems facing us right now around climate and environment and fresh water. And so we set about working on how we might do that. And so we've been working on we've got amazing investors supporting us on the journey, moving towards building the financial infrastructure to help support change. Regenerative agriculture has been our first venture that we've built in order to, one, develop and build out and prove the theory of change, and two, go straight to the heart of where we think the help is needed in Aotearoa to help our farmers make the move. And so we did a soft launch of Calm the Farm kind of early to mid last year, and it just went nuts. We had farmers, farm advisors, we had investors, we had banks contacting us wanting to know how they could engage in this journey. And so we've spent the last, since then, that period of time, really working with a whole bunch of industry players to see how we can make sure that any investment platform is actually going to be enduring and sustainable and able to support farmers in a way that first and foremost helps them before it goes on to benefit downstream players in the industry. And I could talk more about that later. But so yeah, that's where we are today. We've got an amazing team. We've got Pathfinder farmers that we've been working with. We've got some incredible stories coming out of their journey from conventional chemical high input based models through to really light input models where they're making money again. And so I'm happy to share some of those stories too. But kia ora.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mike. That's super interesting. Robyn, I just wonder if we go back a step and just simply explain what regenerative capital means. You know, what does it mean to an investor? What does it mean to a farmer? You know, and because it's quite complex and it's a different way of looking at things, but I presume, we presume that, you know, there is a return for the investors, but also, you know, upside for the farmers. So that would be good to have that explained to us.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to step back and say, okay, before we talk about regenerative, let's examine what degenerative is. And when we talk about degenerative agriculture, that has degenerated both soil health and the financial resiliency of farmers. So if you flip that forward and say, okay, now we're talking about regenerating soil health and regenerating the financial resiliency of farmers, that's the work of regenerative capital. So for us, you know, really it was fascinating because as we were sort of coming together around this concept and saying, clearly there's a need to have value aligned capital that understands the directive of both financial resiliency for farmers, but also soil health. And unfortunately, that's an emerging space. So we were one of the first ones on it, for better or for worse. And what has been absolutely phenomenal to witness is how quickly people have caught on to this concept. And I think, you know, we see regeneration occurring in other industries. You see fossil fuels and you see the parallel of wind and solar. You know, we've seen the food industry where we've had conventional food, and then you see the emergence of organic. And so really the financial space needs to have that same innovation and disruption happening in it, where you take this capital that has the ability to truly make an impact, to truly change an industry, come into an industry and really start to catalyze that change. And again, I think to put the financial resiliency of the farmer first is truly the definition of regenerative capital in agriculture. Can there be regenerative capital in other industries? Absolutely. But for us at rePlant, the focus is 100% on agriculture. So the way that we do that is, instead of thinking in conventional terms, the way we've all been experiencing with conventional lenders, is to think about capital in a much different way and to tie the cost of capital to metrics in soil health. So the lower the cost of capital the farmer is able to benefit from, when he or she can demonstrate soil organic matter, nutrient density, carbon sequestration, water infiltration, water conservation. The carbon sequestration piece is still, the mechanics of that is still very much to be determined, especially in the US. I'm not, you know, there's a lot of sort of politics involved in how that's actually going to monetize and flow down. So for us, water is absolutely the North Star when we think about regeneration. It is a metric that we can capture now in real time. And we know that as soil health improves, so do the water conservation and water infiltration metrics. So we're able to deploy this capital to farmers. They get a lower cost of capital the stronger those metrics are. It's critically important that there's technical assistance on hand to guide that farmer from this transition of a chemical input model to regenerative organic agriculture. And so as you transition off of those chemical inputs and learn how to service the soil, whether it's cover cropping or other means, again, you know, that's an investment that once it's invested, you can't unlearn that. You're not on that chemical treadmill that then required that debt treadmill. And so for us, it's really teaching farmers what they need to do on farm to get off of that chemical treadmill, which then breaks that debt treadmill. And that's a technical assistance partner, depending on the crop type, depending on the farm. And then the third piece, again, that mitigates the risk for the farmer, is to bring in this multinational food company, to bring in that guaranteed buyer that is there for the offtake. So it's looking at the equation and saying, how can we mitigate the risk for the farmer? How can we tie these incentives together that we're trying to achieve, like water conservation, soil organic matter? And then ultimately, again, secure it for the farmer by mitigating the risk to have that partner there for the offtake.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Mike, I just wondered if you had anything to add to that, or happy to move on.
Oh, no, just quickly, I think it's very similar. We have similar ways of looking at this in terms of what we're doing with Toha and Calm the Farm, Chris. I think key to this is making sure that the farmers have the support and are able to collect the data and information. Key to our process too is that if the farmers can prove that they're making these gains in terms of lighter inputs, and in our case, fresh water is a pretty critical target for us. Like Robyn mentioned right at the start, rePlant Capital focus on dairy from the beginning. We did the same, but for slightly different drivers. The reason we focused on dairy initially was because fresh water is our burning platform politically at the moment. Climate's there, but what's right in front of us right now and is most urgent is finding ways to clean up our fresh water systems. And so in that regard, dairy became super important to say, how do we support those dairy farmers who want to make this move to support them? And so things like soil health, freshwater quality, but also looking at input side, so the levels of nitrogen being applied onto the farm. As long as we can see that and measure that, and the farmers can prove that, then we've got a line of sight back to the funders and investors who are prepared to pay and get cheaper cost of capital to the front line to help them make those transitions. The key then is saying, how do we make sure that we can create a scalable model and platform to be able to achieve this at a much larger scale than what we can achieve at the moment and with more urgency.
Cool. Thanks, Mike. So I might just put the next question to you. On Sunday, most of us would have seen the government coming out with their announcement on the draft Climate Change Commission's plan for slashing New Zealand's emissions as part of the Paris Accord. And to quote, they're saying by 2030, the country's farms will be managed more efficiently, producing current levels of milk and meat with fewer animals, less fertiliser and supplementary feed. Stock numbers would fall about 15%. So yeah, the Prime Minister's basically saying we need to return to 2005 levels. So that all looks to fall in line with what Calm the Farm has been talking about and doing. And regenerative organic farms are looking well placed to provide solutions to these challenges. Can you enlighten us, how we can work in line with the government's outcomes that they want to achieve? And I would hope that this will lead to perhaps, a step change in the way we farm in New Zealand.
Yeah, totally. Look, thanks, Chris. I think I haven't been right through the report yet, but some of our team's done some early analysis on it. But if you look at the media commentary as well, and what some of the industry players have come out and saying, you've got your bell curve of different, the continuum of opinions. And so, as we expected, Greenpeace think that it's a ticket to keep polluting for dairy farmers, and federated farmers at the same time are challenged by some of the stuff and know that there needs to be some big shifts for the dairy farmers for this to succeed. But by and large, everyone, I think, pretty much agrees that the report has found has finally found some middle ground where people can come to some agreement on. And so they do mention regenerative agriculture, but also suggest that there's not enough as a solution, a potential tool, but do also suggest that there's not enough science and evidence to support whether or not that's a thing yet. And so to make the most of this opportunity of what's coming through off the back end of the Climate Change Commission's report, we have to think about, in order to understand how we're going to move through this and beyond and nail this, I think we have to understand how we got to where we are today first. And if you think about that, the idea that, and what the Commission's saying in the report, that regen ag, there's not enough science or evidence to know whether it's a valid tool. We've really got to look at our science sector and ask ourselves, why is it we're at this point now when the signals have been coming for 2 decades at least? Strong signals from the market, from consumers, from policymakers, from, you name it, the signals have been there. Why is it our science sector is still not able to answer the question, is regen ag or lower inputs or biological farming even a thing in our current agricultural makeup? And so I think and we've looked into this to see why we've got such breakdown, because when government has to come in with policy and regs to reduce stock limits, I mean, that's market failure, right? If we haven't read those signals as an industry, then why haven't we read it? And how do we not avoid the mistakes of the past, make sure that we can open the gates to the future? And one of the challenges we have in the New Zealand science sector is that we're heavily reliant, with our taxpayer-funded science, we're heavily reliant on industry co-funding. Most of us know we're a country of small to medium enterprises and small farmers, and with a few large corporate farmers in the mix. And so the only ones who can co-fund that science are the guys with a big balance sheet. And so ultimately our science agenda is largely set by those in the industry who can afford to co-fund the science. And so that means that anything on the fringe or on the edge, like organics and like regen ag and regen organics, gets left out of that science agenda. So it's only very recently where we've seen MPI put $20 million up for a regen ag project and a fund, and Beef and Lamb thankfully came out last year and kick-started the research into regen ag and Fit for Better World. You know, it's surfaced there, so we're seeing it come through. But ultimately, if we don't start pouring money into the science sector now to build the evidence base, then the policy is going to be a long way before it catches up with what the climate change is suggesting. So we've been collecting the data for a while to start to understand at grassroots what this looks like farm by farm. And we're certain that the regen ag, regen organics movement has most, if not all, of the solutions that the climate change are looking for. We got farmers who were putting, 150 to 250 kilograms of nitrogen on, got all the nitrogen off in year one, went to diverse pastures and diverse plant species, increased their stock rotation rates, just changed their mindset, their management practices, had really good support and advice along the way, had peer groups set up, and they've taken a massive amount of stress out of their farms, and they're getting profitability back in, within 1 to 2 years. And so we now know that probably over the last 3 to 5 years, the advisors and farmers in the space have made some massive breakthroughs in terms of the methodologies and approaches. A lot of it's science driven, and the science does exist around the world and a little bit here. But a lot of it's also evidence from farmers on the ground. I mean, these are the guys who are getting up at 4:30 in the morning, going to work and not finishing till late at night in a lot of cases, heavily burdened with high debt. And their observations are so critical, but we don't consider them in the kind of the policy space or in the science sector. We've got to make the decisions from outside the farm gate. And so we're seeing more and more evidence right now that the regen ag transition can actually be managed safely and with the right support. And there's, again, there's lots of examples, and I'll give you one. So young farming couple, young children, they were leasing land, family land. They couldn't make ends meet on the farm. The father was working long hours and wasn't seeing the kids. And they decided to go to from twice a day to once a day milking. The day they made that move, they also started their journey from conventional farming, high production to regenerative agriculture. Within 12 months, and then they destocked by 15%. Within 12 months, in fact, within 3 months, the lameness had started to drop away. So all the nitrogen was gone from day one. Diverse plant species went in, stock rotations increased. Within 3 months, milk urea levels, so nitrogen levels in the milk, so flowing through the animals, had dropped significantly. Lameness had dropped significantly. Vet bills went with it. Supplementary feed dropped. And last year, they took $200,000 out of their feed bill. This all goes straight to bottom line, with zero nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen going onto the pasture. And that's one example. We've got lots of those sorts of examples where farmers are saying that the joy of farming is now back. And so they've gone from leasing and looking to get off with one last ditch effort to try and salvage what they'd always dreamed about, was taking over the family farm, to now they're in a position where they're just starting the process to buy the family farm. and there's a number of those stories where farmers were looking to exit. Another one where sixth generation, the kids have just gone back on the farm. They didn't want a bar of it unless the family agreed to convert it to a regenerative organics model. They're 3 years in now. They've just gone organics certified. The soils and pastures and animals are just look absolutely amazing. They're just looking at there's now that they're in the organic premium with Fonterra, and have their input costs down, vet costs down, a whole bunch of their costs have dropped out of the system. They're looking at a 30% stock reduction. They're looking at a 500% increase in profitability. So, you know, these are real numbers.
I'd love to jump in and echo what Mike is saying, because so much of the reason that I'm doing the work with New Zealand is because of the mistakes that we made here in the US. And when he speaks to that industry-funded science, the impact that that had on our farmers was tremendous. And now 20, 30 years in, the farmers are waking up and their kids don't want to come back to the farm. They're massively in debt. The same pattern has happened here, where if a farmer has transitioned, say, 7,000 acres of this conventional heavily chemical inputted farm, as he's transitioned those acres to regenerative agriculture, in the first year alone, he was able to save $500,000 just by his reduction of those chemical inputs. So what we see is in that transition towards regenerative, there's a cost savings because you're pulling back on that chemical input model. And then further towards that transition towards regenerative, that's where the premium for those premium crops comes in. But I think it's really, really important to note that here in the US, we've had that same challenge where you've had industry funded science, basically implying and suggesting that this is all fine and safe and there's no need to do anything. What's been absolutely fascinating is that the multinationals are now breaking with the chemical industry, and the multinationals are saying our consumer wants free from. And in the 21st century, we have tools and technology we didn't have 15 years ago that's bringing a radical transparency to the food system. And then when you start to talk about things like blockchain emerging in this space, there is a transparency coming to the food system. What's been fascinating here in the United States, and again, I think, the political part of this conversation is really important, because we've just come out of one administration that wouldn't have had anything to do with these conversations, now moving into a new administration that has resources and mission and is very much climate aligned, when we talk about these conversations. And here in the US, Syngenta CEO just yesterday authored an op-ed on the critical importance of regenerative agriculture. So there really is a coming together around the climate issue. We understand with farmers that you don't lead there. Again, this is about profitability for farmers. Regenerative agriculture is about profitability for farmers. What we have found is that you have the science funded by the chemical industry. What we're also seeing emerge is science funded that is actually about the human health impact of these chemicals. And we know that those that are exposed on farm are the front line, of exposure with these chemicals. So in the US, there is an emerging cohort of scientists from Harvard and Tufts that have science that they're about to release that really speaks to the toxicity of some of these products and what it actually means to all of us, from farmers to our families. The brilliance in their model is that they decided not to go through the United States Department of Agriculture as they were releasing the science. Instead, they went through Health and Human Services. So again, it's to find allies in these different places and different pockets that can support this transition. But again, when you're talking about putting the financial resiliency of New Zealand farmers first, getting them off of the chemical input model is absolutely the way forward.
Excellent, thank you. We're probably going to sort of double up a little bit. I've got a couple of questions that came in earlier, and one of them is says, we're keen to hear recommendations, advice on how to the initial transition and process from conventional to regenerative while staying profitable. And I know, Mike, you just talked about that a bit, and so did you, Robyn. But actionable solutions and steps would be amazing. So there's a need out there from farmers that are saying, we're interested, we're keen, but we're concerned about staying profitable, and we need to know where to go to get assistance and help through this process, and that's a real need. And I can understand people feeling nervous about changing what they're familiar with to a new way of looking at agriculture.
Okay, so sorry, Chris, that was directed at me. I think to get to that down to farm scale, I'll just jump up a bit for a sec, just to round out what Robyn was just talking about, and off the back of the Climate Change Commission report. Just like science, and Robyn's talked about this, just like we've seen kind of breakdowns in the science sector in terms of funding these sorts of initiatives to build the research and evidence base to show whether they work and how well or not they work. We've got those gaps. We also have those gaps in the financial institutions and the financing products that farmers need in order to make the shift, which is what rePlant Capital is all about, and it's why we've set up Toha. So the Toha science function that Sean Hendy heads is one of the attempts at building an independently funded science model that we can look at this stuff from an independent lens. What does impact? What does good look like? Where's the science already exist, and what new science do we have to do? And how do we make sure we can get science funded that's going to support this journey? But the next key thing is what do the funding platforms look like? So in order to get to that farm scale, like the science sector, we need to keep working with the financial institutions, the banks, and we've been working with a number of the retail banks in New Zealand to look at the opportunity where at the moment we know that for many years farmers have been penalised for example, taking nitrogen off the farm is deemed through the models as being high risk, high debt risk, and so your interest rates are going to go up a little bit. Whereas what we're seeing now, and I think we can only say this as a recent as things have the technologies and the methodologies and the practices have kind of taken a bit of a lift in performance more recently. We can say now to the banks that actually, if you get the nitrogen off and you go down this path, given the right sort of levels of support with the right people out there, we know that the debt risk for your clients is going to improve. And so on that basis, how are you going to reward those improvements? Because at the same time, not only are they minimizing or mitigating out some of the debt risk because they're getting better business resilience back in, they're also mitigating their environmental risk and footprint. And so if the banks took a kind of a medium long-term view on that, we're saying, well, how do we make sure we're collecting this data at scale across a large range of clients, of banks' clients, so that data, the data then points to the loans, the mortgages that then can be bundled up, which can be pushed up into, say, for example, green bond or climate bond space where the banks benefit, but critically those benefits flow back to the farmers, their clients. And so there's a lot of work to do still inside in the infrastructure space throughout the industry, because what we've seen is that between the producer and the consumer, or the farmer and the people who consume the farmer's food, all these organizations and people have embedded themselves in between them. And so the margin and the slice that everyone has to take out of it, either it's going to come from the farmer or is going to be added on to the consumer. And so to get to that, how do farmers, what are the actionable steps take? We can look at the steps on farm, and I'll jump to that in a sec. But if we don't smooth out that the supply chain and the value chain between the producer and the consumer, it's always going to be a challenge to try and break through that to get the margins back on farm, rather than having 100 checks written out every week to get that money off the farm as quickly as possible. So there's that infrastructure work that firms like Robyn's are working on. We're working on, a bunch of others are working on that. That's going to take a long time, but it's worth having a crack at in our lifetime. And that feeds right through to suppliers, the input side. What sort of biological inputs are we talking about? Can we meet the growing demand? What do our financial and debt instruments look like? How do the capital markets respond to that? Everyone talks about needing to invest through ESG policies into the space, but it's really hard to find out whether any of that money is making a difference at all. What is the science that we've talked about? And then where are the consumers coming from? Well, Fonterra said in 2016 that from their 2013 results looking through to 2016, they could show that the consumer demand for organic milk was outstripping the demand side. They told us in 2016 that the premiums for organic milk was only going in one direction, and that's up. And then last year we went over $10 for organic milk. And so you would think that the market would start to address that by saying, well, farmers want a piece of that action. The processors and brands will benefit from it. So let's build more capacity to take that milk. But at the moment, nothing's happened. And so farmers are still kind of stuck, wanting to do organics, but nowhere to send their milk to unless it's in the North Island to Fonterra, for example, or a couple of the small firms down south. So we've got the bottlenecks in the industry that we need to address, but again, we need the funding instruments to make that more friendly fire to help them make those shifts. On farm though, if for anyone who wants to make these shifts, I mean, the first thing I say to people is, if you know how to use Google and you know what YouTube is, and you type in regenerative agriculture and regenerative organics, you won't leave your screen for a month. Right. And in there, and one of the things I say to people and see is, at what point did we lose our ability to think for ourselves about how to filter and digest information? We have this world now where there's so much information out there. There's a lot of noise out there and a whole lot of information's dross. But if you use half your brain on this, you're going to work it out, right? And you're going to see scientists around the world talking about, you're going to see a long, long list of farmers, really credible, influential farmers who are sharing their stories. And then if you look in New Zealand, if you look at the advisory space, you will find advisors, and check out Calm the Farm's website. There's a whole bunch of regenerative organics and regenerative agriculture advisors on there who want to help, and they're making some amazing gains with their farmers. Field days, so go to the field days, and the farmers say themselves, in fact, we've got farmers right now who want to find a way to get a manager on their farm so they can get out and coach other farmers how to do what they've done, because we're going to have an advisor shortfall given the demand that's coming on farm side. You know, we can see there's going to be an advisor shortfall, so the farmers are going to help close that gap. But practical steps, and dairy's the one I can talk about most deeply, and I won't dwell on it, but happy to talk to anyone who wants to afterwards. The immediate things we're seeing is, with good advice, you're seeing that the diverse pastures being direct drilled. You're seeing your stock rotation rates go over 30 days. So you're giving your soil and your pastures time to, and the biology time to kick in and do their thing again. After that first 30-day rotation, because the cow dung has had time to break down into the soil and the parasites and the worms have now had nothing to feed on, you're seeing the farmers are stopping drenching. So you're seeing no drench after that first rotation, and you're starting to see the animals' health pick up. You're getting the nitrogen out of their system. So where we're seeing farmers go to zero nitrogen out the gate on day one, which is a massive risk, which I wouldn't recommend anyone do unless they've got super good support, which is kind of obvious. You're seeing these kind of management practices and tools start to be applied where farmers, and we see this, and we've just had film crews out filming some of them, they start asking others outside for the answers, but we see them over time starting to reconnect with nature again, starting to understand why biodiversity is important. When you see multi-species plants, ryegrass has an optimum limited window of growth in New Zealand, yet we insist on continuing to grow ryegrass. But when you get annuals and perennials and a diverse mixed species, you see some plants boosting in some seasons and other plants doing their thing, and they work together to make sure there's a diverse food mix, and photosynthesis does its job properly. The sugars come back up into the grass and plants and go back down to the soil, and the biology starts working, and farmers observe that. And so they start paying more attention, and now their advisor starts to become nature. And so when Commerce Commission says we need to destock and reduce our methane emissions in agriculture, and Fed farmers say, we think it's a good report, but we've got to be open to technologies like methane vaccinations for cows. This is one of the points around the science, is where's the science to say that a healthy diet for our animals will actually reduce methane emissions? We know that that's a fact, right? But where's the science in New Zealand to give us the comfort that that's a thing? We don't need to be investing in vaccinations. We need to be investing in understanding diet and ruminant and gut health. And so I could go on for days or weeks about this, Chris, but seriously, if anyone wants to talk about practical steps moving forward, then super happy to get on another call later.
Fantastic.
You know, I would
Thank
add to this. I think what has been critical in the United States is the multinational food companies, the food companies themselves recognize that they can be stewards of soil health. And in doing so, then they have a climate story to tell and market towards their consumers, as well as meeting their own internal climate goals and climate initiatives. So to work with the food industry, to work with the food companies, so that you don't create this tension and this antagonism between the two, but to say, how can we work with you and work with your supply chain to help recognize these opportunities for drawdown, for carbon capture, for these climate smart solutions, which then the companies themselves are excited to go out and market. The other area of success that we've seen emerge over the last year in the United States, and again, I think the silver lining of COVID was that it really did expose the vulnerability and fragility in the food system. And as Mike touched on, so many middlemen that were completely, they did nothing. In crisis, they did nothing. So, you know, both the farmer, the food company, the consumer, everybody was looking at like, how do we consolidate? There are too many middlemen in here, and it's created way too much vulnerability and way too much disruption. And so what we have found is that you can regionalize these solutions and to work with policymakers at the local level when you're talking about water at the local level, to work with policymakers. States are now initiating different policies where they're really encouraging farmers to embrace cover cropping, for example. I love that one because it is so measurable and you have tangible metrics. And so it's really, you know, at the state level, at the local level, what are the opportunities to engage in agriculture that is regenerative? And I think really that enables a participation that people feel like they can belong to. And really, again, it's positioning this, you know, at this point in time, it's not either or, it's both and how can we move along this spectrum?
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thanks, Robyn. Thanks, Mike. Quickly, we just got 10 minutes to go, but Mike and Robyn, I wondered how we, as an organic and a regenerative sector, influence government with policy, because they'll be lobbied, you know, by fed farmers, etc., which is their job. Everyone's out there lobbying the outcome that they want, but we need to have a voice. Organic regenerative farmers in the community and the sector need to influence government on these policy changes. How would you recommend we went about that?
I think, you know, it's really important to bring in consumer health. And, you know, what we look at here in the United States, the data is terrifying. And it's why I do the work that I do, especially with family in New Zealand. 1 in 2 men in the United States and 1 in 3 women are expected to get cancer. Cancer is the leading cause of death by disease in American kids. That's not part of the headlines that most people see, but that's the reality that we're dealing with. And I think, you know, here in the United States, I take the position, and I think this is a global position, is we should be paying the farmers to keep us healthy rather than paying doctors to make us better once we're already sick. And so really that's the opportunity, is we're going to be spending the money on one side or the other. Let's invest in the infrastructure and with the farmers. And I think as we've worked with policymakers, as I actually have presented to members in Parliament in New Zealand, that was the point, was, you know, in Wellington, you're building this enormous cancer center, and it's amazing to have that resource in New Zealand, but how do we actually work on the prevention of these diseases so that it doesn't overwhelm an economy? We spend more on healthcare and disease management in the United States than any other country in the world. It is almost 20% of our GDP is spent on healthcare. And I think, again, that is a really important piece for people to understand. And it's what's driving this change in agriculture. It's not being driven at the policy level. It is being driven by farmers whose families are sick. It's being driven by consumers whose families are sick. And so now here in the US, 80% of consumers are trying something organic, and 75% of grocery store categories carry something organic, but only 1% of our supply chain is organic. And so that's that tension. And so again, you know, when you look at this data and as it's emerging and this demand for free from food, you know, free from whether we're talking about allergens or lower sugar, or whether we're talking about genetically engineered ingredients, that transparency is coming. And so to frame it for government as, you know, investing in a healthy food system is the greatest healthcare investment you can make.
Awesome. Thank you, Robyn. Mike, any comments?
Yeah, look, I think in a New Zealand context, I agree with Robyn, we need to get better. I mean, we know now that the nitrogen levels found in drinking water down south have exceeded the WHO's limits for safe limits for fresh water. So we already have health issues with safe water as a consequence of our farming practices in some regions. And it's well known to government and it's well known to industry, yet the same practices still prevail. But on that, and here's how I think OANZ and others here can help influence policy and the government, is if you think about the region down in Canterbury that has, that has these high nitrate limits found in water. We have farmers in one of those catchments where there's seriously high volumes of nitrogen being applied on irrigated land, a lot of dairy, on light soil or ground. And there are farmers in there who are applying zero nitrogen. They are now more profitable today than what they were 5, 6, 7 years ago. And so whilst we can't prove that they're not having an impact on those high nitrate levels from a scientific standpoint, because we know what correlation looks like, but causality is a different ballgame. But it's not hard to work out that when you're applying zero nitrogen, it's most likely that you're having less of an impact on those nitrate levels in the drinking water than other farmers who are putting 400 kgs on. And so these examples and exemplars exist, and what we've got to do is get better at finding that data and information, pulling it together to aggregate it in a way that we can start to use real numbers like that to support our business case, our policy envelope. What is that going to look like if but we've got to try and find ways to do that outside the current kind of dominant reductive kind of science-driven policy lens that we've taken or chosen to take. We've got to find better ways of doing that. So going in and saying we need to do better science or more science in this area won't cut it. We've actually got to go armed with better data and information to support why we think that's the case. And which is why we and rePlant and others are working super hard on saying, let's make sure we're collecting the data and information to support us. We're not just making this up. The question is, can we scale these processes and methodologies? And that's the bit where I kind of go, well, we want to influence policy, but every hour we spend trying to do that is an hour we're not spending with farmers, supporting them. I mean, again, these are the guys that have got the most capital on and take on the line and taking the biggest risk in the industry, end to end. They're taking the biggest risk by far. The other one's getting up and doing a long, hard slog, trying to make ends meet, right? And so from a policy standpoint, we're kind of going, well, you know what, a lot of farmers have actually solved it. So let's go and hang out with them and find out if they're prepared to share some of their ideas and their advisors. And let's see if we can start there, because again, as I say, every hour we spend down the policy end is taking us away from where the real energy needs to go. And that's to the heroes who are getting up early every day, going to bed late at night, got everything on the line. And this is 6 generations in. We're not talking about new farmers here, and someone said in the chat, why are we saying farmers are carrying so much debt? Well, it's a fact that in New Zealand, farmers carry huge amounts of debt. And even when you're 5, 6 generations in, the debt levels have gone up for a lot of farmers, not down. So we've got a problem. And so I kind of get a bit of tension around policy versus frontline action. And for us, it's all about the frontline action and how do we make sure that those people at the front line get all the support they need, and policy will catch up. I've got no doubt about that.
Cool.
Yeah, I think I agree. Policy is going to catch up. We're seeing that emerge in California as these regenerative practices are demonstrating, water infiltration at 500% increase. It's only a matter of time before policy really follows that, especially when you're talking about legislation that's governed by climate initiatives. And when you look at the asset that is water and how precious that is, it becomes, in my opinion, I know Mike could agree, a moral obligation to really have policy that supports that.
Brilliant. So thank you very much, Mike and Robyn. It has been a very, very informative discussion, and like I said at the beginning, very relevant to a lot of the issues that we're facing today. Now, thank you very much also for all your questions. I know, Deborah, you put a few there, Graham, etc. We'll consolidate those questions and put them back to Mike and Robyn, and then send that around to everyone. And like I say, this has been recorded. It's going to be on the OANZ website. It's going to be on our YouTube channel. And thank you very much, everybody, today for participating, for listening to this very interesting webinar. And again, thank you, Robyn. Thank you, Mike. Have a great day.